Well, it's a pleasure to be back with you again. And I come to you as both an astronomer and as a pastor. And so what you're going to be getting in this first service is a combination of astrophysics and theology. And your church pastors told me that this is the most intellectual of the three services. So as we move forward, it's going to be, well, anyway. And as you walked in, you should have gotten one of these cards. And what it includes is a brief summary of what we at Reasons to Believe consider to be the most potent scientific evidences for the Christian faith and the inerrancy of the Bible. And you can actually tear that off, and you can use that as a gift that you can give to some non-Christian friend. But you'll also see a little place here where you can fill out your name and the contact information. And if you do that and hand it into our table at the back, we'll be giving you a free copy of this DVD, Cosmic Fingerprints. And you say, what is that? This is where I speak in front of a large audience in Chicago and tell a story of how I got into astronomy starting at age 7, and by age 16 recognized that there had to be a God to explain this universe, and then through studying a Gideon Bible over a course of 2 years, gave my life to Christ. And 8 years later, I actually got to meet Christians. That happened when I arrived on the Caltech campus. So you get that story, but also includes a close where I field questions from skeptics. So again, we encourage you to use that DVD as a gift that you can give to some friend that's not yet a follower of Jesus Christ. The topic this morning is Beyond the Cosmos. What we've learned from astronomy and physics that tells us what exists beyond the universe itself. Or another title I could put on it is God's transdimensionality. What we've learned about the dimensions beyond the ones that we experience, and how recent discoveries in astronomy reveal the glory and power of God in a way we've never yet been able to recognize. Now I'm going to begin with a quote from Feng Lizhi. You say, who is he? He's China's most famous scientist. Famous for being a brilliant physicist, but also famous for being one of the leaders of the Tiananmen Square protests. But this is what he said in a book that he wrote while he was still in China, Creation of the Universe. A question that has always been considered a topic of metaphysics or theology, namely the creation of the universe, has now become an area of active research in physics. And what he's referring here to is the fact that we now have telescopes powerful enough that we can look so far away we're witnessing the cosmic creation event. You know, in astronomy, it takes time for light to travel from these distant galaxies to our telescope. But yes, we literally have telescopes where we can see the condition of the universe when it was 1/100 billionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second old. We can literally watch the universe come into existence. And it's through that capacity that we're developing some of the most powerful evidences that there must be a God beyond space and time that created the universe. So, for example, when I was first beginning to study this Gideon Bible many years ago, it was the same time when physicists in Britain were developing the first of the space-time theorems. And I actually brought the first of those theorems with me. It's this paper called The Singularities of Gravitational Collapse in Cosmology. And you all got to go out and read this thing. It's public domain now. And if you love tensor calculus, you won't be able to put this thing down. But it does end with a paragraph that we can all understand. What this paper is saying is if the universe contains mass, and as I look out here, every one of you is living proof that the universe contains mass, a couple of you a little more so than others. Okay, if the universe contains mass, and if the equations of general relativity reliably describe the movements of bodies in the universe, then space and time must have a beginning. Space and time must be created, which implies there must exist an agent beyond space and time that brings this universe of matter, energy, space, and time into existence. Now, this had a tremendous impact on the physics community because if you look at the gods outside of the biblical faiths, these are gods that create within space and time that eternally exists. But what's unique to the Bible is the claim that space and time don't exist until God creates the universe. And so immediately the physicists and astronomers recognize the theological import of this space-time theorem. And there are two physicists in particular that devoted 10 years of their career to try to find a loophole so that we wouldn't be forced to accept this agent beyond space and time. And over that 10-year period, they published 5 papers, culminating in this paper. I also brought this one with me for you fans of higher mathematics. Space-times are not past incomplete. I don't know where they come up with the titles for these papers. But what they came up with was actually a far more powerful space-time theorem that any universe that expands on average has a space-time beginning in the finite past, implying a causal agent beyond space and time. Now, only a universe that expands on average will permit the existence of life. So your very existence here this morning is proof that there must be a God beyond space and time that created the universe. In other words, some kind of God exists. And what a lot of people in the pews don't realize is that an important debate was won a couple of years ago. I mean, if you pick up the latest books being written by atheists, physicists, and astronomers attacking the Christian faith, they concede that there must be this God beyond space and time. Lawrence Krauss, probably our country's most famous atheist, wrote in his book, A Universe from Nothing, this statement: based on the space-time theorems, one cannot rule out such a deistic view of nature. The battlefield today is whether or not this God beyond space and time is a personal being. But because of the force of the space-time theorems, they've been driven to the conclusion there must be some kind of deistic entity beyond space and time that creates the physical reality in which we live. Now, it wasn't Stephen Hawking, it wasn't Arvind Borde and Alexander Vilenkin that made these statements first. They were actually made in the Bible first. In fact, you heard the quote made earlier today. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I remember reading this for the first time when I was 17. What does this mean? I read through the Old Testament, discovered you never find the word universe. Biblical Hebrew does not have a word for the universe. But they have this phrase, shamayan ares. When it's attached to the definite article, it always means the totality of physical reality. So if you read through the Old Testament, you'll find in 9 different places it uses this phrase, the heavens and the earth. But it means all of matter, energy, space, and time. And when it uses the word create, the word is bara, which means to bring into existence something brand new that never existed before. So what the Bible is saying here is there's a beginning to all matter, energy, space, and time. The New Testament puts it this way. Let me go back here. Here we go. This grace was given us in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time. So we actually have several places in the New Testament. You also see it in Titus, which speaks about an explicit beginning of time and what God was doing before the beginning of time. Hebrews 11:3, the universe that we can detect did not come from that which we can detect, and we can detect matter, energy, space, and time. Now, I've given a more detailed report of this to audiences that are exclusively made up of physicists and astronomers in many university campuses. The response I consistently get is this: all right, you've given us scientific proof that this God created the universe, but who created God? I'll bet you each one of you have heard that one. In fact, I got that from both of my sons when they were 3.5 years of age. Dad, if God created the universe, who created God? In fact, you can go online at our website, reasons.org, and you can listen to a debate I had with Lewis Wolpert at Imperial College in Britain, chairman of the biology department there. And that was his comment: who created God? And he thought he had me stumped. And when I said, well, let's go back to these space-time theorems. These space-time theorems tell us that there's this agent beyond space and time that created matter, energy, space, and time. What is the definition of time that we use in science? It's that dimension or realm in which cause and effect phenomena take place. So it said, notice what the space-time theorems are saying. Cause and effect is occurring before cosmic time exists. Therefore, what we've discovered in the space-time theorems, this agent that created the universe, at a minimum, must have the capacity to move and operate and create, not just within one time dimension, but at least the equivalent of two independent dimensions of time. Now, I said, if this creator can work in two dimensions of time or more, what does that tell us about your question? Okay, we could have the universe existing on a timeline here. Let me give you a little diagram here. Say this is the timeline of the universe. We could have God operating on a second timeline, infinitely long, that never crosses or touches the timeline of our universe. As such, that God has no beginning, no ending, and is uncreated. Then I shared with Lewis, if you look at all the holy books that make up the religions of the world, the Bible is the only one that says of God, no beginning, no ending, and uncreated. Mathematically, it's only possible for a being who has access to the equivalent of two dimensions of time. Notice, too, you got passages like Psalm 90. A day of the Lord is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like a day. A day of the Lord is like, 1,000 years is like a watch in the night, which is only 3 hours. What Psalm 90 is telling us is that God can arbitrarily compress time or expand time in our context. Mathematically, that's only possible if you've got access to the equivalent of two dimensions of time. And I show you that in diagram form in my book, Beyond the Cosmos. But it's not only that we physicists have established that the creator of the universe must have access to more dimensions of time than what we can experience, but also more dimensions of space. How many of you have ever heard of the Large Hadron Collider? It's a particle accelerator in Switzerland and France, the most expensive science experiment ever conducted by humanity. The thing costs $10 billion to build, and it's $1 billion a year to run. But this is the instrument that is discovering new fundamental particles. And it's because of this instrument and the theoretical physics that comes out of particle physics, we now recognize that there's not just length, width, and height. There are 9 dimensions that make up the universe. This actually goes back more than 20 years. It started at Caltech. That's where I served on the faculty for 5 years. And while I was there was a research group started by Jeffrey Schwartz. And he got a bunch of graduate students together and said, what we notice is if all you got is length, width, and height, there's not enough room for all the symmetries that are demanded by quantum mechanics and gravity. And so they began to work out, okay, how many extra dimensions do we need for gravity and quantum mechanics to coexist? And they must coexist because life depends upon it. And they finally worked out over about a 2-year period, it's somewhere between 8 dimensions of space and 26 dimensions of space. It took another dozen years for them to figure out the right answer is 9 dimensions of space. Now, from a cosmology perspective, what's happening is the universe rapidly expands from the cosmic creation event with 9 dimensions of space, all of them rapidly expanding. But when the force of gravity separates out from the other 3 forces of physics, 6 of those 9 dimensions stop expanding. So today we've got 3 big dimensions and 6 very tiny ones. You say, how tiny are they? Well, the 6 extra dimensions are rolled up as very tight scrolls around the 3 big dimensions. But the cross-section of the scroll is 20 orders of magnitude less than the diameter of an electron, which is probably why most of you haven't noticed it. It also explains why you don't even notice it in particle accelerators like the Large Hadron Collider. And so now we know that there are at least 11 dimensions that make up the power and the capacity of which our Creator can operate in, which addresses the question, where is this God? Well, God must exist and operate both within and beyond the 1 time and 9 space dimensions that make up the universe. Or, to put it in a biblical perspective, God is simultaneously and continuously both immanent and transcendent. Those are 2 of the core doctrines of the Christian faith. that we worship a God who is immanent. What that means is it's a God that can operate continuously and simultaneously in every corner of everything he's created. He is everywhere. So he's sitting right now closer to you than you are to anyone else. And he does that throughout the entirety of your life. But he's also transcendent. He's totally free to operate without any restrictions, completely independent of anything he created, including the dimensions that he created. Now, when I was 17, 18, and 19, I was going through the holy books of the different religions of the world. And I found religions like Buddhism and Hinduism that teach that God is immanent, but not transcendent. And then religions like Islam that teaches that God is transcendent, but not immanent. What's unique to the Bible is it teaches that God does both. He is simultaneously and continuously both immanent and transcendent. Jeremiah 23:24, can anyone hide in secret places so that I cannot see him, declares the Lord. Do not I fill heaven and earth? Or what King David says in Psalm 139, if I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise in the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. In other words, there's nowhere we can go where God is not physically present right next to us. And that's true of the entire universe and everything he created. This is the immanence of God. But then we have 1 Kings 8:27. The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. Or Job 37:23. The Almighty is beyond our reach. God whom no man has seen nor can see. So Paul here in Timothy is saying, it is impossible for us to see God. It's impossible for us to touch him or make physical contact with him. And yet, the Bible declares he's physically very near to each one of us. You'll find repeated over 8 times in the Bible this statement, the Lord is near. Or what you see in the New Testament, he is not far from each one of us. So how can God be invisible and untouchable and yet physically very close to each one of us? Well, it's impossible for us human beings to visualize dimensions beyond what we personally experience. But it is possible to visualize less. So to help me with this message this morning, I've invited an extremely handicapped couple to join me up here. This is a couple that, unlike all of you, only has 2 dimensions of space. Will you welcome Mr. and Mrs. Flat? Okay? And we're going to put them in a universe that I'll call Flatland. So they're in a 2-dimensional realm. And when Mr. Flat looks at his wife, what does he see? He sees a line. And he can walk around her and see different lines. And then he can kind of get the outline of his wife. But as a 3-dimensional being, I can look down on him and I get to see the whole outline immediately. Now, I can put my hand 1/10 of a millimeter above their plane. Notice that I'm now physically closer to them than they are to one another. But because I'm above their plane, they can't see me, they can't touch me. It's the same way with the God that created the universe. He is physically closer to you right now than anyone has ever been in the whole of your life. Yet you can't see him, you can't touch him, because he's beyond our dimensions. 1 Samuel 16:7, man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. I mentioned that Mr. Flack can get the outline of his wife, but he has to calculate it with his 2-dimensional brain. I get it right away from my 3-dimensional perspective. But something else I get from my 3-dimensional perspective, I get to see what's inside. Notice all he can ever discern is the outline of his wife. I can get that, but I could also see what's inside, which is the basis of the Christian faith. You know, what I loved about the Gideon Bible I was studying, it ended with the point, God knows better than any human being what's best for every human being, and therefore it only makes rational sense to put the creator of the universe in charge of your life because he knows you better than you know yourself. And so I did that at age 19. Now, one of the things I noticed as I went through the holy books, religions of the world, is how only the Bible teaches eternal security. Only the Bible gives us a picture of heaven that's beyond what we can think or visualize. And only the Bible tells us that we worship a triune being. Notice that every non-Christian religion, every Christian cult denies the doctrine of the Trinity. Okay, here's Mr. and Mrs. Flat. The only way that they're going to have any physical contact with me is if I come into their dimensional realm, which is what the creator of the universe did on Christmas Day. Came as a baby. He lowered himself and humbled himself, as it tells us in Philippians 2, and lived amongst us as a human being. We can make the mistake of thinking that the incarnation of Jesus in Nazareth is the totality of the Godhead. No, he lowered himself and humbled himself. For example, I could put one finger through the plane. Mrs. Flack could come and investigate and conclude that I am a small circle. Well, I'm much more than a small circle, but that's all she can perceive in the dimensional realm in which she exists. And of course, she would go home and give the news to her husband, and the next day, I could go to her husband, only this time I'm going to put 3 fingers through the plane. And he's going to say, hey, wife, you were wrong. It's not 1 circle, it's 3 circles. We could imagine them having quite a debate. And next day being Sunday morning, she goes to the church of the 1 circle, and he goes to the church of the 3 circles. From their limited dimensional perspective, they could not perceive how this 1 finger and these 3 fingers could all be part of a single 3-dimensional closed surface. So from our 3-dimensional perspective, we can see the 3-ness and the 1-ness can be simultaneously and continuously operable. Likewise with the doctrine of the Trinity, it's God in 3 persons, but 1 essence, 1 purpose, 1 plan. Now, we've done surveys in our church in Southern California where we go around neighborhoods and survey the unbelievers as to why they don't believe. What surprised me is that 15% gave as their primary reason for disbelief the impossibility of reconciling human free will and divine predestination. The Bible teaches that God has given us total control over our words, our thoughts, and our actions. We are free will beings. But the Bible also declares that before God created the universe, he had predetermined every thought we would think, every word we would speak, and every action we would perform. Now, it's impossible to reconcile those 2 doctrines if you're going to try to make it work in length, width, height, and time. But the physics tells us, the Bible declares for us, that God is much bigger than length, width, height, and time. So, for example, what I want you to visualize here is a sphere. Not a sphere of space, but a sphere of time, with 3 dimensions of time. And what we're going to do here is we're going to put the timeline of our universe along one of the latitudes of the sphere of time. And notice we can put God at the North Pole of this sphere of time, and he can drop a perpendicular timeline to when he created Adam and Eve. He can drop another perpendicular timeline to when our present moment, and a third one for when the universe will have fulfilled its purpose and God replaces this universe with a brand new realm, the new creation we see in Revelation 21 and 22. What I want you to notice is that these 3 distant points along our timeline of existence all join together at a single instant of time up at the North Pole of the sphere of time. Now, that's not the only way, but it's one way we can demonstrate how God, from a single instant of time, can simultaneously operate over the entire age of the universe, your entire lifespan, or the entire history of humanity. What this does is demonstrate how this transcendent creator can foreknow everything. But it tells us in Ephesians 1 that God only foreknows, he predetermines. Now, I don't have time to demonstrate this morning, but if you pick up our book out there, Beyond the Cosmos, I give you a set of diagrams where I show you if we simply allow God to be as big as what physics now proves at a minimum he must be, there are at least 3 independent ways God can predetermine and yet grant us free will. And by the way, all 3 might be wrong. I think God's got thousands of more options than just the 3 operate. But what I did in the book is show you it's not a contradiction. If we simply allow God to move and operate in the equivalent of 12 space-time dimensions, there's multiple ways you can grant every human being free will, and yet God can predetermine every word, thought, and action. So you can check it out in this book, Beyond the Cosmos. And by the way, I purposely brought Mr. and Mrs. Flat here so that you can go home and cut out your own Mr. and Mrs. Flat. And you can actually do your own little demonstrations and to show people how God can do amazing things if you allow him to have the power that he does. And you'll also find out there's a little DVD called Beyond the Cosmos. It's something we basically did to equip you to give the same message you heard me give this morning at a little more of a lay level. And we found this to be a very effective tool with children. Because what I've noticed in our church and other churches, children begin to ask transcendent questions when they're 3, 4, and 5. And it's so tempting for us who are parents to say, wait till you're older. I would encourage you not to do that. When my boys were 3.5 years of age, they were asking me questions like, how can God listen to all of our prayers when everybody's praying at once? I answered those questions, and they understood it. And it gave them confidence that God was listening to their prayers. So yeah, the first time you hear these questions, whether it be from an astrophysicist or a 3-year-old child, you want to answer it right there. Don't delay. And so this DVD is designed to help you do that. You can also get this book, Why the Universe is the Way It Is, which it basically explains why it is that God has constrained us to length, width, height, and time. It's crucial that he do that to bring about the end of all evil and suffering. But once that's been accomplished, Romans 8:23, God will deliver us from this realm of limited physics and take us into a new creation, Revelation 21, where we'll no longer be constrained by length, width, height, and time, no longer constrained by gravity or electromagnetism or the strong and weak nuclear force, which explains why Paul says no one can think or imagine how great and wonderful it will be. It's beyond our capacities to imagine. But we kind of give you a head start and trying to figure out the physics of the new creation. So check that out. But I want to close with what I think is one of the biggest challenges I've seen from skeptics about the Christian faith. It's this idea that we have the creator of the universe coming here to planet Earth, and he chooses to die on a cross. And in that death on the cross, he pays the redemptive price for every human being who's ever lived. Takes upon himself the penalty for all of our offenses against God and one another. But what skeptics have charged is, how can that happen in just 6 to 9 hours? If you read the biblical text, that's how long Jesus spent on the cross before he gave up his life. How can you actually pay the atonement price in just that short period of time? Well, it wasn't just a man that was dying on the cross. It was God dying on the cross. And what I want you to imagine here is there's the screen, and we're going to have a timeline that goes from behind the screen straight up from the screen. So it's going straight up from the screen. That's why I put that little shadow there. And there you got Jesus spending 6 to 9 hours on the cross. But because he is God, he is able to suffer on a timeline that goes up and down along the screen. Moreover, he's not constrained to just 2 dimensions of time. He can suffer on 60 billion infinitely long parallel lines of time that go in a 3rd dimension of time. And what I want you to perceive is that this man who died on the cross can actually suffer for the equivalent of 60 billion times infinite time, all compressed into just 6 to 9 hours of our experience of time. And therefore, that this Jesus, in just 6 to 9 hours, can pay for an eternity of torment for billions of people. It can be done simply by acknowledging how powerful this individual was who was spending those 6 to 9 hours on the cross. Hebrews 2:3. How shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? And what I've found in my years of ministry, there are many people out there who don't receive the offer of God's redemption because they don't know how big that offer is. So what I'm giving you here is a little tool to help you demonstrate the magnitude of the price that Christ paid when he died on the cross. If you pick up the book, Why the Universe is the Way It Is, you can give them a positive approach. Give them a vision for the minimum of the reward of the new creation, and share with them the magnitude of the reward that Christ is promising for those who received his redemptive gift. If we can measure what he did for us on the cross, if we can measure what he's offering for us in new creation, how can anyone in their right mind turn down such a magnificent offer? But I think it's our responsibility to present the magnitude of that offer. Now, I took a course in mathematics at the University of British Columbia. It was a course on complex variables. It was basically a course on these extra dimensions. And our professor began by showing us a basketball. And he says, see this basketball? In 4 dimensions, you can turn it inside out without making a cut or slit in the hole of the basketball. He says, let me prove it to you. He showed us a video clip where we got to watch it 2 dimensions at a time. But none of us in the classroom, including the professor, could visualize how it happens in 4 dimensions. It's impossible to visualize phenomena in dimensions that you can't personally experience. Well, as I went through the holy books of the religions of the world, what I noticed was the Bible was unique in presenting these trans-dimensional doctrines. Only the Bible presents these trans-dimensional doctrines. You don't see the Trinity in any other holy book because you can't visualize that in 4 dimensions. You don't see eternal security in any other holy book because you can't visualize that in 4 dimensions. Likewise, the simultaneity of free will and predestination. What that showed me when I was 19 years of age, these other holy books are inventions of human beings because they talk about God and what he can do in dimensions that we can experience. But the Bible gives us a description of God and what he can do that's beyond what we can think or imagine. Therefore, it and only it can possibly be an inspired revelation from one that transcends the space-time dimensions of the universe. And that was a big factor in my giving my life to Jesus Christ. Now, I'm going to be giving 2 more messages in the second and third service. You're welcome to join us for those. And hey, if you can't get enough of this, we're actually doing a cruise this summer where you can spend an entire week with our whole scholar team. And by the way, we kind of carve up the hours. I begin at 5 a.m. in the morning. Fuzz Rana stays up till 2 a.m. in the morning, so you can literally ask questions and dialogue with our speakers. But we'll also be giving a series of messages on evidences for the Christian faith that have never been presented before anywhere in the world. So you can take advantage of that if you want. And let me just close us off with a little word of prayer.